Here's another action in that effects action that I gave you. And if you've already downloaded it, just simply follow the links below and re-download it because I just added it in. It's this effect texturizer, and I'm going to simply play this. It does a couple different things. It creates a stamp visible layer, which will add some sharpness to your image, so you can make sure that you get the details around. Um, like for example, when you're doing a portrait, you want their eyes to be sharp and things like that. This allows you to select a texture, and it says right here, you can select a texture, just make sure it covers the image. I'm going to supply you with these 24 textures as well. So all I have to do is just simply stretch this and make sure it covers the available image space. And the image space that's being created, that checkerboard that you saw, is the same as your whatever image you're creating. So it will automatically resize, so you can make sure that the texture that you're creating or the texture that you're utilizing is fitting your image. Hit the checkbox there, or the check mark, and it will update and push this through. So we're going to use this wrinkled paper texture, and it's going to do a bunch of other things for you. Gives you directions you can follow, and you can see it applies a general texture to the whole image. Doesn't look really good right now because it's over top of her and everything. And I'm using the same stock image that I had before. I'm going to select this portrait background, or this portrait, the original file, and I'm going to simply select subject here because I want to remove it from her. But I'm going to do a little bit of modification here. You don't have to do this, and select subject may not work, but you can do any particular operation you need to get the selection that you're looking for, whether it's just brushing on or whatever you're looking for. Okay, so I've got a selection created. I'm going to go to my texture and say I want to remove this texture information from here. I've got an opacity of 50%. Let's increase the size of my brush. I'm going to brush this on, and I'm just going to simply brush over this entire thing with a 50% opacity. Okay, and you'll notice that it doesn't remove all of it. It does remove a lot of it, but it doesn't remove all of it. So what I'm going to do then is brush down. Let's remove it off her skin. I want to make it more aggressively removed from her skin because I don't want her to look wrinkled and stuff like that. So then to get over her hands, I'm just going to simply click and move over her hands a little bit. I can even daub just by tapping the brush a couple times to get what I'm looking for. And then I'm going to make this brush even smaller, and I'm going to go just over her eyes and her eyebrows, like the bridge of her nose down onto her lips, to make sure there's no texture applied to those, and then get this eye as well, and maybe even this little lock of hair that's coming there. Okay, to make sure it removes the texture from those. Okay, so I've got the mask selected, and I want to make a little bit tighter mask, so I'm going to press Command or Control L. With the layer mask selected, I'm going to darken up the darks and slightly darken up the grays. So just simply by pulling this toward the right, you'll see the layer mask thumbnail gets a little darker. So got that, and now you'll see it'll restrict. You can see a little bit on the edge of her hat, and that looks pretty good to me. I've also got this sharpness layer. Let me shut off the texture effect, and what you'll see, let me zoom in, is if I zoom in here, if I turn this off and turn this on, you'll see a little bit of sharpness applied. You see it especially quite good on her hair up here, and it's a little too strong for me, so I'm going to double click on the high pass layer. Right now the default out of the box is set for 3. You can reduce this, or you can increase this dramatically and make it almost like a painted effect. So let's pull this back to 1.5. Say okay to that, fit this onto the screen and then turn my texture back on. I've also got brightness and contrast that I can play with on that detail, so I can increase the texture, which will kind of increase the sharpness a little bit, and reduce the brightness or increase the brightness depending on what I want to do. Just basically do whatever looks good for you. Now on this texture effect layer, okay, I've got an invert operation here. I can hit invert, and what it'll do is it'll make the texture of the blacks whites and the whites black, and vice versa with the different gray ranges too. So you can see you get a completely different effect. I kind of like the first one, so I'm going to leave it that way. And then there's a hue saturation adjustment layer, or not an adjustment layer, a smart filter. And I'm going to go in here and say I want to make this kind of blue, because I want to put this over there, and I want to make it a little bit lighter. Okay, looks pretty good to me. And I've also got a Gaussian blur that I can then apply, and what it'll do is it'll soften the texture. Like if you look at this, the texture is really harsh and not bad, it's just maybe not what I want it to be. So I can simply double click on the Gaussian blur and open this up a little bit, and you can see how it softens that texture. It's still there, it's just not quite as prominent, I guess would be the way I'd describe it. And then you also have the brightness contrast here, where you can turn down the brightness, turn up the contrast, which will bring up the texture, turn down the texture, turn down the contrast, which turns down the texture. So we'll say okay to that. That looks pretty good. Now, I know this sharpness effect that I have down here, I want kind of just on my subject. I don't want it on the background or the edges of her hat and things like that. So it's kind of just the opposite of this mask. So what I'm going to do is press Alt or Option, pull it down, let go. It'll replace that. I select that mask thumbnail and then press Command or Control I to invert that. So you can see now most of the effect is going on her face, like all of those places, her hands, her face, her neck, and the edges of her hair, you know, the places where I want it. And then I've also got this vignette effect that occurs up at the top. I want to turn that on, and you notice it dramatically darkens the image, but I don't want that applied to my subject. So again, selecting layer thumbnail, or layer mask thumbnail, pull that up and Alt or Option, drag it up, so then I can choose. So now it's darkening just a little tiny bit on there, but it is not darkening her skin and things like that. So what I want to do, I'm going to select that layer thumbnail, layer mask thumbnail, press Command or Control L, and I'm going to make this a little bit darker. So the grays, I want to affect it less on her skin and on her sweater, and like essentially just the main subject of the image. Okay, so I want it kind of constrained to the background. So you can see I've got it constrained to the background, and I can manipulate the opacity of this layer to turn it down, or I can utilize the entire effect. Like I look at this and say, well, the effect is a little too strong for me, so I want to turn the whole thing down. I can do that simply by going to this effect texturizer group and just turn that down. So then I can shut it off and turn it on, and you can see in just a matter of minutes I've managed to create a nice little effect to this image. You can make it as subtle as you want. I mean, you can really pull this back so it's just kind of there, but it adds something different to the image that you wouldn't otherwise get from a standard photograph. Okay, hope you like it.